So hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Glad that you're joining us here today for this pollinator gardening and insect conservation webinar. So we're really doing this in order to get the word out about the great Florida pollinator census. So we'll talk to you all about that and how you can participate this year and years going forward. But what we decided to do is educate you a little bit on some pollinator related topics. So each of us, we have multiple speakers here today from IFAS Extension. Each of us is going to cover about 15 minutes of a topic, and we'll start off with mine, which is pollinator-friendly pest management. Then we'll learn a little bit about parasitoid and beneficial insects from Caitlin Salazzo at Manatee County, insect conservation from Cheryl Vanderheiden over at Lee County, the top 10 pollinator plants for Southwest Florida with Tia Silvesi, who is at Hillsborough, and then we'll kind of wrap up with strategies for a pollinator-friendly yard and the 2025 pollinator census with Forrest Hecker, also with me at Sarasota County Extension. So with that all said, I'm going to go ahead and start off with this talk, which again is pollinator-friendly pest management. So I'm Jackie Liebowitz. I'm the chemicals and the environment agent at IFAS Extension, Sarasota County. So I teach people all about insects and how to manage them and whether they even need to be managed, which little spoiler alert here is not always going to be the case. So we're going to briefly talk about pollination so that we're all on the same page. Context is important. We'll go over common insect pollinators, common insect pests. We'll talk about integrated pest management, or IPM, which is essentially the core of what it means to do pollinator-friendly pest management. And then we'll go into some more specific pollinator-friendly pest management tips, and then I'll pass it on to the next speaker. So, pollination. It's actually estimated that over 90% of flowering plants require pollinators. So if we didn't have pollinators, we would lose foods like almonds, apples, bananas, chocolates, just to name a few, and of course, coffee. So those are just a smattering of crops that we have that do require that pollination. And so really at the key to the survival of crops and these agricultural systems is the honeybee, which you may have heard of, Apis mellifera. And although we have the honeybee that helps us with all this agriculture, there are so many more pollinators that we have right here in Florida that we're going to talk about. All right, so this is just a very small little sample of what you might find here in the state when it comes to insect pollinators. And yes, there are pollinators beyond just those bees. So when we talk about bees and wasps, they actually belong to the same order, Hymenoptera. So they're also related closely to ants. Honeybees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, and so many more are going to belong to the family Apidae. And so there are thousands of bees within just that one family. We also have these gorgeous blue-green sweat bees that you'll often find hovering around flowering plants here in Florida. Leafcutter and mason bees, which are very interesting. They create these little structural nests for themselves out of natural resources. We also have spheicid wasps and plenty of other parasitoid wasps that Caitlin is going to be sharing more information with you about in a little bit in our next talk. Then we also have flies, which, believe it or not, are extremely efficient pollinators. Some argue maybe even better than the bees, especially in our wild systems. So there's tachinid flies, syrphid or flower flies, bee flies, which I think are absolutely adorable. You can actually see a picture of one in that far right in the middle of those pictures to the right of the slide. Very fuzzy, very sweet. Beetles are maybe an unexpected pollinator to many. So we have soldier beetles, which I think are really interesting, and they belong to the Cantharidae family. And one of the most iconic of the pollinating beetles is the goldenrod soldier beetle. So if you've ever seen those big, beautiful golden blooms around the fall in Florida, the goldenrod soldier beetle is actually known to help pollinate those plants and spread them around. And beetles are actually one of the earliest pollinators that we have too. And there's also butterflies and moths belonging to Lepidoptera. So there are many, many different kinds of butterflies and moths. And what's interesting about them too is that they're active during the day and the night, depending on what species. So they help pollinate a lot of those nocturnal plants as well, those plants with nocturnal blooms that only open up at night. So there's the white peacock butterfly that we have all around the state, which we have featured in some of our promotional materials, and they belong to the brush-footed butterflies. And then we have skippers, which are tiny little butterflies that you might see around a lot, especially in our ground covers like sunshine mimosa. So there's a lot of different insect pollinators out there, right? And we consider these beneficial because they are performing that service for us of helping promote the existence of those flowering plants. Like I said, a vast majority of flowering plants need pollinators to survive. Now, on the flip side, right, and this is one of those things that we have to talk about because it, pests are a thing here in Florida, right? There are a lot of different pests, and people might not always be able to differentiate between friend or foe when it comes to insects in the garden. So we're just going to quickly go over insect pests and what a pest even is. So just a little generic definition here to help put it into context. Pests are really any organism that's going to pose health, environmental, economic, or aesthetic risks. Now, when we talk about landscape pests in particular, we can divide them up into two main categories based on their mouth parts. So this is going to inform how they feed on the plant and whether or not they can transmit disease. So there's that first bucket there, piercing, sucking mouth parts. And what you're looking at right there on the screen is a very close-up image of an aphid with its stylet, which is basically like kind of a sharp straw of sorts. So they use that stylet to pierce into the plant tissue and suck out the sap, so the sugary nutrients that the plant holds. And some examples of pests with piercing sucking mouth parts include aphids, like the one pictured, scales, whiteflies, and chinch bugs. Then we also have chewing mouth parts. So chewing mouth parts are going to belong to possible pests like caterpillars, leaf miners, grasshoppers, and mole crickets. Those are just some examples there, but they have these pretty intense mandibles that you can see in the picture there that they use to tear apart solid material. So they're not drinking that sap, but they are tearing apart things like leaves or wood as they're feeding. Now, less than 1% of all described insect species across the world are considered pests. So I hope that really puts things into perspective for you that most of the insects that we're going to encounter on a regular basis are either beneficial, so they're doing things that are important like pollination or perhaps even their own form of pest control, or they're harmless, so they're not posing any risk to us or the environment. So really less than 1% of all described insects are considered pests. Now, of these two categories, I want to have you pay special attention to the pests with the piercing, sucking mouth parts because these are the pests that are associated with transmitting plant disease. So they're the ones that are going to require more management than others. Now, ID is key, right? We talked about some common pollinators. We talked about some common pests. I would be here for hours and hours if we were to go through each one and talk about those distinguishing characteristics so that you'd feel comfortable assessing what's what. So what I really want to impart to you is know how to identify or know who you can go to, what resources you can use for proper identification. So proper identification is important because why? And you're welcome to post a guess to the chat if you'd like, but I'm just going to launch into it just in terms of saving time here. One, we are avoiding harming beneficial insects like pollinators when we identify the insect before we treat, right? So many times it turns out that we're not dealing with a pest at all. So if that's the case, right, why do we need to bother treating it? It's just unnecessary use of time and resources and potentially introducing something that's toxic into the environment. So we don't want to do that. You also want to make sure too, if you do have a pest problem, that you have the right solution for that problem. So not every pesticide is made equal. Sometimes they can be very specific. And so you need to make sure that you're choosing the right product or the right combination of tools and strategies to deal with that particular pest problem. And like I said, sometimes we don't have a pest problem to begin with. It could be that someone just saw a ladybug larva and they look a little weird and they got concerned because they were on this plant that they care about, but turns out they are beneficial and we do want them there. And identification is what we consider the first step in integrated pest management, which I'm going to cover in just a moment. Now, I want to make you aware of some helpful resources. The first thing is going to be the Featured Creatures EDIS collection. So it is a collection of EDIS publications. These are just short written online articles that go over some of the common insects you might find here in Florida. And there's also the UF IFAS bookstore. So if you are someone who's outside a lot and you like field guides or books or anything of the sort, you can buy a lot of materials from that bookstore. And then if you decide you need some help with identification, if you're uncomfortable trying to make that distinction between pest and beneficial, ask your local extension office for help. And the other option too, if they don't have a designated entomologist or bug person on staff, you can submit a request to the UF Insect ID Lab. And there's a small cost associated with that, but you get some really great information. So you have to think of yourself as a little bit of a pest detective, right? When we're going about figuring out what the problem is and how to tackle it. That identification is really going to be the most important thing. And so it's the first step, as I mentioned, of integrated pest management. So what is integrated pest management? You're basically using a combination of steps and strategies to suppress pest populations to an acceptable level. What does that mean? Well, if we tried to get rid of every single insect in the landscape, it's not very practical. It's not very feasible to do. And if it is, it's probably going to be very expensive. So we're really just trying to get those pest numbers to the lowest possible that they can be so that we're not having to deal with the effects of the pests. And remember, a lot of insects fly. So you might get rid of that population there, but that's not going to necessarily prevent more from coming in. It also really focuses on prevention versus reacting to a problem. And by using these different steps and strategies, we're overall reducing the need for pesticides. When we do have to intervene and solve a problem, we are opting for lower impact strategies. And that is a big part of integrated pest management, is always trying to find the lower impact solution first before we move on to things that are higher impact or may have more effects on the environment and ourselves. So because of this, it's considered very pollinator and wildlife friendly as a practice. There's 5 main steps involved in integrated pest management. There's identifying the pest, as we've gone over. There's monitoring the population, so figuring out how many are there. And if there's a lot, maybe it's time for you to jump in and determine when it's a problem. So the action threshold is when you decide to take action and figure out your management strategies. Speaking of which, step number 4 is to use IPM strategies. So it's a combination of tools and what I consider the toolbox, which we'll look at in just a second, that you can use to, again, reduce your need for pesticides and really think about why is the pest there and how do I make the environment less favorable to the pest. And then after you do all that, evaluation is that last and really important component of IPM, because you could do everything you think is right and the pest population doesn't go away. Maybe it even increases. And so you have to figure out what happened and steps that you need to take to correct that issue. So I mentioned those IPM strategies or tools. You may have heard these before. There's cultural, physical, mechanical, biological, chemical. Cultural is very much focused on doing things like watering and fertilizing properly, maybe not scalping your grass so that it can grow and get enough nutrients from the sun through its leaf blades. Physical mechanical is using tools or machinery to remove or reduce pest populations. Biological is basically using a living organism to help. So that could be more microbial, or it could be something like a predatory bug or natural enemies that already exist in the environment. And chemical is referring to pesticide use. So figuring out which tools you want from the toolbox to use together synergistically to tackle the pest problem is what integrated pest management, or IPM, is. So I'm going to kind of finish off my presentation here with some pollinator-friendly pest management tips, if you will. So of course, just to drive the point home, you want to practice that IPM, or integrated pest management. It's really a mindset, and it might seem like a lot of work, but I promise you it is the most sustainable, cost-effective, and time-effective strategy for long-term pest management. Because you can spray something and get rid of pests, but that's not going to guarantee that they will stay away. Something has to change in the environment for them to not be as attracted to that space. If you do need to use chemical intervention for any reason, always try to opt for those low impact pesticides first. Biorational products are generally going to be less toxic, but the rule of thumb is anything you apply, you have to read and follow the label for, to make sure that you're using it for the right situation and the right pest. You want to avoid any chemical applications during active foraging periods. So I like to think of the worker bees as going out from 8 to 5, kind of like us, many of us. So if you can avoid applying pesticides during that time, and also when there's active blooming, that can be very helpful in terms of reducing that exposure to bees and other pollinators. Don't buy plants that have been treated with harmful systemic pesticides. Just one example I have are the neonicotinoids. There are some neonics that are actually a little better than others, but the point is when they're systemic, they stay in the system of the plant. And so that things that are foraging or feeding from them end up dying or experiencing some really negative side effects. So ask about the pest management routine at the nursery that you shop at, or or I guess I should say, shop at local native nurseries. So you can go there, and chances are, if they're local and they're smaller, the staff is probably going to be a lot more familiar with what they're doing to manage pests. And you can also just avoid pesticides in general. So create these pesticide-free zones for your pollinator garden. And if you have somebody else who's maintaining that space, make sure to add clear, legible signage so that you don't have to worry about accidental sprays. All right, so some bee sources, which I will post to the chat momentarily. And other than that, I think we're ready for our next speaker.
Okie dokie. Thank you, Jackie. Okay, so for my section of the presentation, I am going to be talking about the beneficial insects that you don't see. And that is just my funny little way to say we're talking about the itty bitties, the little guys, the guys that go unnoticed, or the guys that just you don't think are as beneficial as they actually are. So get ready. We're going to go on a little journey under the microscope and really immerse ourselves into this micro ecosystems that are literally all around us. And so here is just an example of a few observations that I have made under the microscope, and they are not really important to this talk at all, but it's just one way to show that there are so many things out there around us that we don't actually notice because they're too small for us to notice. So all of these, this fly, this aphid-like insect, and this mite, they're all smaller than the tip of a pencil. So these are things that happen underneath our eyes all the time, and we don't realize it is because of how small they are. So if there's one thing that defines my personality is that I love the microscope. I could spend my whole life just looking under the microscope, and so much so that I will get up and my legs are numb. And then the other thing about this presentation is I really love an underdog, which I'm sure a lot of us do like underdogs. So not saying there's anything wrong with this beautiful giant swallowtail butterfly. I love to see them just as much as the next guy. But when I get the chance to see this guy over here on the right, who is a predatory mite, and they have ginormous mandibles that they literally just leave open like this, and then they wait for prey, which is a smaller mite or insect, to come by and just close it. And so they are beneficial predatory insects that are about the size of a grain of salt. So they're about zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.6 millimeters long. So they're really, really small. And so, and the point of this is not to make you sound like you have to go full crazy, like I have gone full crazy and just obsess over these tiny, imperceivably small insects and mites. Um, but really, what I want you to end up taking out of this part of the presentation is that both of these arthropods on the screen are very beneficial in their own right. One is a pollinator, one is a predator, and they're both worthy of conserving, even though one of them you can't really see with your naked eye. So that's the moral of the story. All right, so I'm going to start with letting us ease into this, and we're going to start with something a little familiar. Bees. So we're all familiar with the bee grouping. Jackie mentioned it a little bit. But are we fully aware? Do we fully comprehend how diverse the grouping of bees are? So I have three pictures here and three pictures of very diverse bees. We have giant carpenter bees, which are like the size of your thumb. And then we have metallic bees, for example, the sweat bees. Metallic bees and sweat bees are my favorite kind of bees. And so those ones with varying sizes, and then you have the leafcutter bees um, that hold their pollen on their abdomens. So in this structure called a scopa, which is a little bit different from, the honeybees that hold their pollen on their hind legs. So three pictures, and already there's crazy amounts of diversity. But of course, this is my presentation, so I want to talk about size. There's a big size diversity between bees as well that we don't always realize. So we have giant carpenter bees. This is the head of a carpenter bee. And for a size scale depiction, there's is the smallest species of bee. It's a mining bee. We do not have this species in Florida, um, but do have we do have similar sized species here in Florida. So again, even within the bees, there is this crazy amount of diversity and size diversity. I'm sorry. And but of course, this presentation, we're talking about the underdogs. So let's talk about some other pollinators, and Jackie already mentioned a lot of them. So we have flies, for example. Flies are some of my favorite pollinators. Jackie mentioned the bee flies, which I do really like bee flies as well. Over here, I have an example of a trumpet flower that's attracting a whole bunch of flies. But my favorite pollinating flies are the syrphid flies or the hover flies. Not so much because they're pollinators as adults, which they are pollinators as adults, and you can see two pictures of adults in the center. But my favorite thing about them is they're actually voracious predators as larvae. And I find this to be extra interesting because if you know anything about fly larvae, is they are actually just basically bags of goo. They're just like water balloons filled with hemolymph, which is just goo. And so they're really, really fragile on my scale. So if I'm looking at one under a microscope, I touch it the wrong way and it just pops. And so I think about something that's so fragile on my scale, but when you get down to the scale that they operate on, so you have one here eating an aphid, they're actually really effective predators. So I find that to be fascinating. You have really effective predators as the immatures, and then they're beneficial pollinators as an adult. So it's a win-win situation with the syrphid flies. Um, but of course, there's a whole cast of pollinators. Jackie mentioned a lot of them. We have beetles, we have moths that are important with the night blooming flowers. We have vertebrates like bats and birds and humans. Humans are really important pollinators these days. I don't know about you, but if you have like squash or something, you just take that male flower and just hand pollinate yourself. So there's a whole bunch of organisms that are important in the pollinating sphere that also deserve recognition in addition to the bees and the butterflies. But I don't want to spend too much time on pollinators because they're interesting, they're good, but I am really interested in predators and parasitoids. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the next bit of the presentation. But there are many other ecosystem services that insects provide. And so some of those are decomposers, breaking down dead material. They are the baseline of most food webs. They're really important soil engineers, and they also are primary producers for stuff like honey and silk, but also for stuff like medicine and even pesticides. So they're really important for making products that we use on the daily basis. Um, but I'm going to focus on the predators and the parasitoids, and they can be a little hard to differentiate. So, in order to get it straight in our heads, predators are insects, or they can be anything that will eat many prey throughout their lifetime. So, for example, I have lady beetles who will eat hundreds of aphids within their life cycle. And then when you have parasitoids, it sometimes is confused with parasites, and every now and again they'll be used interchangeably. But in reality, parasites are going to be more, um, they are organisms that live in or on a host for their entire life, and they don't usually kill their hosts because if they kill their hosts, they're out of a home and out of a food source. Whereas parasitoids, they are almost always insects, and they are insects that lay their eggs in or on their host, and the larval stage or the immature stage of that insect will continue to eat the insides of their host. And then once they mature, usually they kill their host and then they become free living adults. So that's kind of the difference between predators and parasitoids. We're definitely going to go more into parasitoids in a second. All right, so this slide is just me saying I have a bit of a bone to pick, um, because I grew up in the age of the internet, and I was inundated in meme culture. And I, since the day I was born, everyone just seems to love on bees, and yet wasps never get the same kind of love. And I never understood it. Everyone just thinks bees are wonderful and amazing. They pollinate, they make honey, and for some reason, wasps are just incarnations of the devil, apparently, and they just exist to sting people and do crime. And I would hope if you're one of those people that signed up for this webinar, you don't fall into that trap. But you probably know people that fall into this trap. And so after this presentation, I do expect if anyone sees any of this coming through their Facebook feed, it's a requirement now that you have to be in the comment section and defend the WASP and their honor, because I've had enough of WASP slander. And I think you guys will have enough of wasp slander too when we're done with this. Um, so no more of this. Wasps and bees are both beneficial. But why? Like, why am I so adamant about preserving the reputation of wasps? Well, they do a lot of beneficial things. First of all, they also pollinate. I think people seem to forget about that because wasps don't always have specialized pollen structures like bees have. So, honeybees have the corbicula, which is where they carry the honey or carry the pollen on their hind legs. Most wasps don't have that. But most wasps, as adults, they feed on nectar, and that's where they get their energy source. So they're also hopping from flower to flower carrying pollen. So they do pollinate. Sometimes they're incidental, and sometimes they're really important. So, like the fig wasps, these are the ones in the lower right. It's one of the coolest looking wasps ever. But they are the primary pollinators of most fig species. So, also really important pollinators as well. But where wasps really shine, and my favorite aspect of them, is their beneficial parasitoids. And so I briefly described what a parasitoid was, and I don't know if it really clicked for you guys what they are, so I'm going to go through a little scenario. And we're going to see just kind of how metal wasps actually are. So imagine you're a little aphid, and you're the bane of most gardeners' existence. So you're just with your family gathering together and you're building up your population really, really fast. And aphids can do this because they don't have to mate to reproduce. They have this thing called parthenogenesis, so they reproduce asexually. And then not only that, they also can have live birth. So you don't even have the egg stage. An aphid will just squirt out a new aphid, and then it's already starting to feed and then creating new aphids itself. So their populations can get out of control really fast, and I'm sure you've noticed that. But have no fear, the wasps are here. Um, And so here is just one of the hundreds, thousands of species of wasps that are so small, imperceivably small. I wish I could accurately describe to you how small. They're about zero point 0.8 millimeters. So again, really small, but it just doesn't compute in your brains. And they will come in, and rather than using their ovipositor to sting us like some other wasps, they use their ovipositor to inject an egg inside the aphid. And so inside these aphids, there's a wasp egg and soon to be a wasp larva moving inside of it and feeding on the aphid. And eventually, the aphid will succumb to the wasp larva that's living inside of it, literally eating it from the inside out. And once it's done, it will pupate inside the husk or the mummy of the aphid, and it will chew its way out through an exit hole, and then it will emerge to go inject more babies into more aphids. And so these guys are super, super common. They are everywhere, even though we don't notice them because they are so small. They're smaller than the gnats that get stuck to your face when you're really sweaty and you walk through like a cloud of them. Like they're really small and they're everywhere, but we don't notice them. Um, all right. So other things about while we're fangirling over wasps, wasps are also really, really large. So they have a crazy size diversity, like the bees, but even more so. So, and I'm sure you've heard about the murder hornets that were in the news a little while ago. Like those wasps are about the size of your palm, but a lot of them can be the size of your thumb. So they can get really big, but what's more important to me and more interesting to me is how small they can actually get. It is kind of crazy when we think about it, and none of these pictures do it any justice, but all of these wasps are between zero point 0.5 and zero point 0.8 millimeters, which is roughly the size of a grain of table salt. And it's just imperceivably small. I actually have a parasitoid wasp inside this vial right now. Can you see it? No, of course you can't see it because it's so tiny. I can barely see it. I almost threw this away because I forgot I had it in there. They're tiny, but they're everywhere and they're doing the Lord's work by taking care of all these pest bugs that we have. So, in conclusion, all wasps, we love you. You're beneficial parts of the ecosystem. It's about time we stop hating on wasps. They're beneficial too. All right. So with the final bit of my time, I don't have enough time to go into all the facets of how awesome these organisms are. Um, I want to talk about how diversity is not really a linear process like some of us may think. So right now you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I'll add one Florida-friendly plant, and then that will kind of increase my diversity by a factor of one because I'm adding one plant. But in reality, diversity is exponential. It increases exponentially. So when you add one Florida-friendly plant, now you're adding dozens of herbivores that feed on that plant, which will attract even more parasitoids and predators that will feed on those herbivores. There's even this little thing called a hyperparasitoid, which you should Google it, but they only parasitize already parasitized insects. So the diversity that we cultivate after adding one Florida-friendly plant uh, builds on itself so much so that it's exponential and we'll get hundreds of new connections, adding just one different plant. So the take-home message is really, I hope that you take out of this that there's a whole world outside that we don't always realize and we don't recognize because we can't see it with our eyes. And so even though we can't see some of the diversity that's out there, it's worth conserving. It's worth doing IPM, even if you can't see the beneficial mites that might be hurt when using certain pesticides. So it's important to notice all the diversity, not just the stuff that you can see. And next time you're outside, just like take a really close look at all of the stuff that's going on plants. And there's actually this really awesome event going on at like August 22nd and 23rd, which is crazy. It's an event where just have you sit and you look at a plant for 15 minutes. So I don't know about you, but I would maybe go online and get like a really cheap hand lens, and you could use this while you're just looking at plants, and it'll And it's just adding some curiosity that's really just, it's fun. Even if you don't know exactly what you're looking at, you just know that there's a whole new universe. Um, and so, yeah, diversity is around us. It's all around us. And so I'm going to end my section. And if you have any questions, of course, you can reach out to me. And I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl, who's going to really elaborate on the conservation of insects. And so hopefully you recognize why it's important to conserve them. And then we'll talk about the specifics. So,
Yeah, all this little stuff. Make sure our presentation's up. Here it goes. I'm ready. Hello, hello. Thank you, Dr. Caitlin. That was excellent. You gave us a awesome and wonderful view of that amazing world of tiny wasps and other tiny things. I love the microscope too. I'm going to now take you way out. We're going to zoom way out for the big picture and talk about the need for insect conservation. And hopefully, you'll identify the role that you can play in it. So, you may have seen this. I don't know why there's Arabic written in. Do you see that? Is that on your screen as well?
Yes,
Let's see if
I
I
do
can
see
remove
it.
that.
I'm not sure,
I have
but yeah,
no
we'll try to
idea.
remove that. Just keep going.
Okay. Hilarious. Anyway, um, you may have seen this. I have to restart it now. I clicked by mistake. So back one slide in the head again. So you may have seen this. This is the Tree of Life. It's a decades-long project. It's supposed to be represent all described life species. Each branch of the tree is a theoretical branch of evolution, and each leaf represents a species. So here you can see all of life encompasses about 2.25 million species. And if you zoom in on animals, this tree of life has approximately 1.5 million species. And then how many species do you think insects are among animals? And quickly, this one has described just under 1 million species. So you got to ask yourself, if there are 2/3 of our described species are insects, what is the problem? What is the need for conservation? Huge problem. And it happened about a decade ago when a German study um, described 70% decline in flying insect biomass in 27 years. So this German study had been monitoring certain um, natural areas in Germany over 27 years and found both the decline and the abundance of insects, which they described as grams per day, and also the diversity of insects. Attributed this decline, the two major causes that they came up with was the loss of habitat and also the fragmentation of that habitat that was left, and pesticides, pollution that was accumulating. The others' papers followed, and in 2019, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a lifelong entomologist wrote a paper about his experience and perception in tropical Latin America, in Costa Rica specifically. And although he had been working with insects his entire life, he did not have a lot of surveys of abundance of those insects. So he couldn't use any data. He had to use his experiences and anecdotes from other people. So he described how lights in the gas station had been attracting millions of insects, of flying insects, but that he now didn't see any, or how you could not drive through the rainforest without thousands of insects smudging up your windshield. And that was no longer the case. So it made him think, where have all the tropical insects gone? In the meantime, another group of researchers went through decades of historical reports, 73 historical surveys. They wrote a review article called Worldwide Decline of Entomofauna, a review of its drivers. And entomo refers to insects, of course, where we get entomology from. And fauna means animal populations, or what exists in the ecosystems. So entomofauna refers to the collective populations of insects. Found a measurable decline. In fact, they estimated that we are currently experiencing a 41% decline in insect populations and insect abundance. They estimated that the local extinction rates of insects could be as high as 10%. And then they calculated an annual worldwide loss of insect biomass at 2.5%. That may not seem like a lot, but over the years, that is massive. They believe if things continue as they had been, we would see an extinction rate of 40% in the next few decades. This is what their data looks like compiled on a map. The decline is centered in Europe and visible in North America, in the United States. But that is simply where the data came from. Many parts of the world, especially the tropical places where insect biodiversity is highest, simply have not been measured. They also defined the four greatest drivers. Now, a driver is a major cause that continue to affect the decline of insect populations. The first one was habitat loss. This is the switch from natural areas and sparsely populated subsistence farming to highly managed land uses like commercial agriculture and urbanization, development of cities. Pollution was their second highest driver, the continued use of synthetic pesticides, but also fertilizers, which change the nutrient composition of a particular place. Biological agents was third on the list, like insect diseases were coming in, and invasive species that can outcompete the native ones. And finally, climate change made it onto the list of the four most important drivers. In other words, changes in weather patterns. This is not necessarily warming, but perhaps less rain in a rainforest makes it dry out more, or excessive rain produces floods. So you might say to yourself, but why should I worry? We have so many insects, right? But simply said, our natural processes and our ecosystems need the insects. Our ecosystems are highly organized. Our climate and soils determine the type of plants and plant communities that grow. And then insects feed on those plants in many ways, or they feed on the dead plants. And those insects that feed on the plants transfer that energy and the sugars from the plants to higher trophic levels. So insects feed animals that are larger than them, more mammals, and then those animals feed animals further up the food chain, and so it goes. So without this large food base of insects, animal populations would collapse. In fact, 60% of birds are insect eaters. And then insects stimulate decomposition of some very tough organic materials. For example, wood. They break down dead organic materials from both plants and animals into smaller pieces. They actually work in harmony with decomposers. They bring in fungi and bacteria to clean up the ecosystem. Termites might be pests in our houses, but they are amazing engineers in nature. Many insects speed up the removal of dead plants and animals as well. Fly maggots and scarab beetles make short work of a dead animal. Dung beetles are responsible for cleaning up the pastures of the Great Plains. They roll up the dung and move it underground, where when it is buried, it can decompose back into nutrients for the plants and will not wash off with rainstorms, for example. And of course, the insect world is full of predators, and they feed on each other as well as on plants and animals. And parasitoids, I should not use parasites, I learned today. So in our yards, we are always on the lookout for things like mealybugs and scale because we think they weaken our plants. But it's actually the other way around. Those pests, quote unquote, primarily attack already weak plants. And in nature, that provides a way to clean up and clean out our plants and that are not planted in the right place. When you have resilient plants that thrive, weak plants don't reproduce. Nature will find the balance. And of course, pollinators, which is what we're talking about most here. But with pollinators, Jackie told us 90% greater of 90% of wildflowers rely on insect pollination. We're always assessing and always learning more. And many of the food crops require that as well. But insects and plants also have a mutualistic relationship. Insects help plants reproduce, and plants provide food and shelter for insects. And some of these relationships are so tight that certain plants cannot reproduce without their insect partners. And some insects cannot survive without their plant food. So though not all 80% of wildflowers rely on insect pollination, have that kind of tight relationship with a particular insect. Those that do, however, are more in danger of losing their partner when insect species decline. So what can you do? Hopefully this has produced a bit of a feeling that there's something that you must be able to do about this. I've taken the big picture and kind of smushed it in a really small nutshell. But here are my suggestions of what you can do. First of all, you can look at your piece of nature, your backyard, and say to yourself that you want to adopt a sustainable ecosystem for that piece of nature that is entrusted to you. That means that you're looking at managing the ecosystem as an opportunity to let nature establish itself again. It doesn't mean that you have to remove all boundaries, but you can work with nature as opposed to against it. And you will hear more about that with Tia and Forrest's presentations coming up. When you allow yourself to adopt an ecosystem view, you will inevitably embrace the importance of insects in your landscape. And finally, here's my favorite part. You can join a scientific study on insect monitoring and conservation. You don't necessarily have to go to school for that, but you can if you like. And that's where citizen science steps into play. You can join a citizen science project. You may have heard about citizen science, or they call it participatory science. Sometimes it's called community science. Some projects are led by citizens, by the lay people that have a passion for that particular insect or ecosystem. Others are developed by researchers at universities, and even government agencies have started citizen science projects. These projects develop because the span of research would be too large, either in time or in space, for one person or one team of researchers to complete the work. Without the help of the public, this kind of data is just not accessible. So a project is developed that invites community members, club members, school children, just about anyone interested in observing and collecting data for scientific use. These are immensely valuable for insect research because the sheer size of the abundance and diversity of insects. Much of the data that revealed the decline in the German natural areas was taken from citizens monitoring insect populations, especially butterflies and bees. So here is a little small example of the kinds of projects that you can join. And I too am running out of time, so I will just plug what we are involved with in August. So IFAS Extension has come alongside the University of Georgia to host the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, and we've dubbed it in Florida as the Great Florida Pollinator Census. So stay tuned for more about that at the end of the seminar as well. And the benefits of citizen science to research and monitoring for conservation are just fabulous. They're overwhelming. But there are also benefits that are for you to join a project. You have the opportunity to learn and interact with nature in a meaningful way. And you have, if you're already have an interest in nature, this hones your skill as a naturalist. Then you help observe, record, and discover, and who knows, you may discover something new, like these students in Australia. This is for you, Caitlin. 1,800 school kids in Australia joined a citizen science project called Insect Investigation through their school. And in the process, they collected over 12,000 insects and discovered a few new species. Guess what they discovered? Tiny parasitoid wasps. And this was just published in March this year. So find your science niche. Hopefully you'll find it with us in October. My name is Cheryl Vanderheiden, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was fabulous. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now.
I have to unshare mine.
And next we're going to talk about plants, because I like plants. Plants needed to attract all these beneficial insects to your yard. And so, hi everybody, my name is Tia Solvesi. I'm an extension agent with University of Florida, IFAS Extension in Hillsborough County. And I'm going to be talking about the top 10 pollinator plants for South Central Florida. So this is just a little bit of a teaser list, you know, kind of starting from the small plants, and then I'll get up to some big plants. But you want to have a good diversity of plants in your yard to attract these beneficial insects. Here's one that is not very common. It's the heliotrope. And the common name is the pineland heliotrope. The genus used to be Heliotropis, but it's recently been changed to Euploca polyphylla. And it has kind of these curling flower arrangements. And what you can do with this is plant it as a ground cover. It's great as a border plant, and it does come in both a white and a yellow form. So this is a long-lived perennial. It does not die easily once you get it established, and it will attract all kinds of interesting insects like bees. Here in the picture is a four-spotted scolid wasp. And I learned about that wasp by observing it on the flower because I like plants and flowers. It is also extremely drought tolerant. It's kind of native to the South Florida area of the state. The next plant I'm going to talk about is Coreopsis, and this is our state wildflower. There are several species of Coreopsis native to Florida, and I'm just going to highlight the Coreopsis leavenworthii or Leavenworth's Coreopsis here. It has these beautiful yellow flowers with a dark brown center. You can see there are some insects pollinating them in this picture. And in the lower picture, you can see how tall it grows. It can get up to about, 2 or 3 feet. And so it's great in your garden because it will self-seed in the immediate area where it's planted if you're using pine straw or you don't have your mulch too thick. This does attract a lot of butterflies, bees, wasps, and it almost blooms all year round. There's many other Coreopsis species like the Coreopsis lanceolata that are common in native plant nurseries, and those are just equally beneficial. I just couldn't mention them all here. So see which one grows the best in your area and get some of those in your yard. You can also buy these in a seed pack for, $3 or $4 a seed pack from the Florida Wildflowers Growers Cooperative near Gainesville. The next one is a Florida-friendly plant called pentas. And, if you're just starting with a pollinator garden, this might be a go-to plant because it has that instant effect, that beautiful, vibrant color. It comes in pink, purple, white, red. The scientific name is Pentas lanceolata, and it's not native to Florida. It's native to East Africa, but it does very well in Florida. It is a long-lived annual or a perennial. It will live for a couple years. And it's just a great nectar source for all kinds of bees, butterflies, even hummingbirds. And one special note here, look for the old Florida varieties or the tall pentas, as some people call them, because they're larger plants and they'll have more blooms than the dwarf varieties that stay very small and compact, unless that's what you need for your landscape. The next one I'm going to talk about is milkweed, and there are many species of milkweed, both native and non-native. To keep this talk short, I'm just going to talk about 3 of the native species that are common in South Central Florida. The top one here is the orange one, the butterfly milkweed or Asclepias tuberosa. The one here in the middle is the swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata. And then the smallest one is the aquatic milkweed, Asclepias perennis. And all of these are supposed to be perennial, but they do go dormant in the winter, and that's what helps keeping the monarch butterfly migrating, down to Mexico, and also reduces disease pressure in butterflies. And so we do recommend the native milkweeds. You know, if you're growing one of the non-native, the tropical milkweeds or a giant milkweed, you know, it's better than turf grass or concrete, but we do recommend to plant the native varieties. And this attracts mostly butterflies. It is the larval host plant for a monarch and its relatives, like the queen and the soldier butterflies. And then it also is a nectar plant for a variety of pollinators. The next one here is the button sage lantana. And this is one of my newer favorite plants. You can see the picture on the right has an up close of the creamy white. They can be purple lavender flowers. All the flowers are the same color here. So don't get this confused. For the picture on the left here, which is Lantana chimera, which is a invasive species of lantana we recommend removing from your landscape. But the button sage lantana, it's almost like a small shrub. You know, it can grow 3 to 4 feet tall and just be covered with flowers and pollinators all year round. It is a little sensitive to the cold, so maybe not recommended for North Florida. It is also extremely drought tolerant. So I plant this in areas where I can't get other things to grow. Maybe there's a landscape company that always mows and sprays, and this is one of my bulletproof go-to plants that if I start it from a 3-gallon pot and put it in, then it will survive. It's big enough that it won't get mowed over, or a little bit of herbicide won't kill it either, because it has a little bit of woodiness to it. Now moving into the small shrubs, the next one I'm going to talk about is wild coffee. And this has a great scientific name, Psychotria nervosa. So it is related to the coffee that we drink. And it does get these little red berries that are good for birds and other creatures. But this is a great pollinator plant. We have a hedge of this in front of our extension office. And if you look real close, you'll see honeybees and other pollinators visiting these clusters of white flowers. So if you are in South Florida, there is also the Bahama wild coffee, which is a little more cold sensitive, the Psychotria ligusturifolia, and that one has an even longer bloom period. So this is a great kind of bulletproof native to Florida shrub here. Next is the tea bush, and I don't like that common name for it. It should be called like bee magnet bush or something a little bit more catchy. Melochia tomentosa is the scientific name, and this is native to Florida. This is a great, you know, specimen shrub, or you can plant a couple in a row. They do grow a little bit taller, like 5 to 6 feet tall. They are evergreen and they have these small, you know, whitish silver blue leaves. And then they just get covered in these small pink flowers, which insects love. Last year, when we did the pollinator census, I looked at this and there were too many insects to even count. I was just making mark after mark. It's just covered in insects. So if you're a native plant enthusiast or you want to get something different for your yard, I would highly recommend this tea bush. And it is also very drought tolerant once established. Next is the beautyberry, because if you're a beginner gardener, this is a great shrub. It's native to Florida. The scientific name is Calicarpa americana, and it gets the name beautyberry from these beautiful stems covered in purple berries. But before there's berries, there's a ton of flowers that are great for pollinators. So this not only attracts pollinators such as bees, wasps, butterflies, but then the fruits also provide food for birds and other organisms. It's a great plant. It does go lose its leaves, or it's deciduous, and so it will lose its leaves in the winter and it will just be like bare stems, and then it will flush out in the spring with all new growth and look very pretty with all the flowers and the berries. Next is the firebush. So firebush is a larger shrub. It can grow, 10 to 12, maybe even to 15 feet if you're not in a area that's get any freeze. But the scientific name is Hamelia patens, and this is native to Florida, native to South Florida, and it does stay evergreen. So this is one of those go-to landscape shrubs that everyone should have in their backyard, as part of their pollinator garden. It adds that height to attract different types of creatures. It supports a variety of bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, birds, and it does produce little berries too that are food for wildlife. If you are in a more cold sensitive area, this can completely freeze back, and then often it will grow back from the base. And if you need a smaller plant for a smaller space, there are a couple different dwarf cultivars or nativars of this firebush available. And so look for those dwarf varieties if you need it for a smaller space. So last but not least is the cabbage palm, and kind of moving into tree form, tree shape, but cabbage palms aren't technically trees, they're just palms. And the scientific name for this is sable palmetto. It is native to Florida. It's considered our state tree, even though it's not a true tree because it's not woody. And you wouldn't know by, just looking at it from afar, but this plant has a huge inflorescence, or that's just a fancy name for a flower stalk that has thousands of flowers. And you can see those covered in all kinds of insects and pollinators. So here's a photo actually of a saw palmetto, but you can see all those flowers just blooming at the same time. So palms actually provide a ton of flower and nectar resources for pollinators. So those are just the top 10, according to me. And we have an IPPM brochure that you'll receive as part of the webinar, and that some of these are listed in there too. But there are many, many more flowering species. So, look in your Florida Friendly Landscape Guide. We have the plant app online. There's also the Native Plant Society and the Florida Wildflower Foundation, and many more resources on pollinators and pollinator attracting plants for your landscape. So thank you very much for listening in and learning about the top plants you can plant in your yard for pollinators. Again, my name is Tia Silvasi, and I'm with UF IFAS Extension, Hillsborough County. So next I'm going to pass it on to Forrest, and Forrest is going to tell you what you can do to attract pollinators to your yard.
All right. Me. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Forrest Hecker. I'm the Florida Friendly Landscaping Community Educator for Sarasota County, and I'll be talking to you about strategies for a pollinator-friendly yard. So for this presentation, we're really going to start from the ground up, and we'll talk about why that's so important. But a lot of people, they have turf grass in their landscape already. But a lot of times it's not necessary. You should only really have turf grass if it's providing a function in the landscape. If you have kids playing out in the yard all the time, if you have a dog and you need to walk it out in the grass, some people have bee allergies, so they can't have flowering ground covers. Turf grass might be the best ground cover for you, and Lots of cases, even if it is the best ground cover for you, people are mowing it way too short and frequently, and they're not following UF IFAS recommendations for care. So you should be mowing at the optimal mowing height, which are listed here for the different types of grass. This is going to lead to a healthier grass where it's going to be greener, it's going to require less chemicals, there's going to be less disease issues, less patches, and it will also, if you're not scalping it all the way down to the ground, it's going to provide more shelter for insects and pollinators to hide around in your landscape. But when it comes to ground covers, my big area of interest is alternative ground covers or even just mixed mowable ground covers. So just adding in things like perennial peanut, the orange flower you see on the left, or sunshine mimosa, the native pink flower you see on the left picture. These are two very ornamental ground covers that mix very well into grass. You don't have to go and spend thousands of dollars redoing your yard. You can plant these two plants and they're just going to spread into your landscape. They both provide really great nectar and pollen resources for our pollinators, and the sunshine mimosa is a native plant, and it's also the host plant for a little dainty sulfur. So I have a blog series called the Lawn Ornament Blog Series where I cover many of these weeds that people commonly already have in their lawn, and they can provide a lot of boons to our pollinators and local ecosystem if you leave them or even let them start to outcompete the grass. So when it comes to your landscape, we've already touched on it in some other presentations, but biodiversity is key. If you have just one plant in your landscape, like some people, they only have turf grass. They don't even have like a tree in their yard. I see many people in neighborhoods have that. They'll just have a St. Augustine lawn. There's very few insects that can utilize that, and the more species of plants you put into your lawn, your landscape, or as trees, the more different insects will be able to utilize those plants. So the most common relationship people think of is how butterflies need specific host plants, but a lot of different insects need specific host plants beyond just butterflies. So you really want to focus on native plants. Florida-friendly plants are usually plants that are considered drought tolerant, things that don't need lots of chemicals or fertilizer and are going to thrive well. But when it comes to promoting our native wildlife and our native pollinators, we really want to focus on the native plants. And in particular, there's things called keystone species, which are the cornerstones of the entire ecosystems in our area of Florida. And so there'll be a link shared out to you with the different keystone species for Florida. Also, when you're putting in plants, I see lots of people just buy one wildflower, one small plant, and just put it in. You really should try to propagate that wildflower when it seeds. Try to get a grouping of them, because the pollinators, when they're going around looking for resources, they really want to not fly around a lot. And in the case of like honeybees and things, they'll go back to the hive when they find really great foraging area and be like, they'll communicate it to the rest of the hive. They're like, go here. There's a lot of plants grouped together that are perfect for this time of year. And yeah, grouping plants together does help, but biodiversity is still key. A really important thing in your landscape is to really try to make it three-dimensional. So a lot of people have what I call two-dimensional landscape. It's just going to be turf grass and a tree or two. Every single leaf, every single branch is surface area in the landscape, and it's going to really exponentially increase the amount of habitat you have in your landscape when you have trees, you have canopy trees, subcanopy trees, you have shrubs, you have different perennials in the landscape, you have different ground covers. All these different layers in the landscape are providing different habitats, and so a lot of pollinators and insects are going to move up and down these layers throughout their life cycle. So like butterflies, when they're in their larval form, they're caterpillars, they're not flying around. They can sometimes, there's a lot of skippers that will be on to different species of grass. And then it's not until they're adult where they're flying around using shrubs to land on and trees to land on. So create those layers in the landscape. A really big one, in my opinion, is wood. Wood is the backbone for a lot of insect life in our natural areas. Snags are what are called dead trees that you see pictured on the right. These really provide tons of shelter and resources for things like a lot of carpenter bees, a lot of native bees. They need this wood for part of their life cycle. And there's many other insects and pollinators that need the wood. And I will say you see pictured on the right, there's a little bee hotel. These have become quite popular in recent years, and I will say I saw them. They seemed expensive, and I never was a believer in them, but one was donated to our office. We installed it, and it really always is a hive of activity. There's all different types of native bees and wasps utilizing it. And now the woodpeckers have figured out that it's like a lunch buffet, and it's just a whole ecosystem is around just this habitat that has lots of little nooks and crannies for the different larval stages to hide in. And you can also just put in logs into your landscape. If you come out to our extension office, we have quite a few just logs used as borders, used as landscape features, and they are great for insects to utilize. Another really key part of a landscape is providing water. Water, especially in the dry season, is an extremely valuable resource. We have altered and drained so many of our wetland areas, concentrated water. And if you can really create like put in bird baths and other water features into the landscape, you'll be surprised on not only the birds and the wildlife that come in, but the pollinators. Right now, in the heat of the summer, it's not uncommon to see butterflies. They'll come down to mud they'll get electrolytes, and they don't really need nectar so much because, or they don't need water so much because they get a lot of water through nectar, but they're coming down getting electrolytes and wet soil. You also see honeybees in these hot days. They'll come by the hundreds to a water source, a bird bath. They'll get water, they'll take it back to their hive, and they actually have a form of AC where they release the water when they get back to the hive to cool it down. They beat their wings while they're releasing it. It's a very cool thing to witness. Another really, really important thing for many pollinators is leaving some natural areas of the landscape, like leaving leaves that fall off a deciduous tree, or leaving a patch of soil that is just naturally, it's just always, nothing grows there. It's sandy. Maybe you just leave it there as a little patch of sand, because you'll be amazed. There's a lot of miner bees and other native bees that need this bare soil to create little tunnels and pupate until the next year. So leaving little patches of bare soil, leaving the leaves as a layer instead of in the landscape, instead of bagging it up and getting rid of it, are both great ways to help our pollinators and insects and overwinter and survive year after year. This has already been touched on a couple times before, but try to reduce and eliminate pesticides until only to use what is necessary. So follow that IPM strategy, those IPM strategies that were already touched on. Only use chemical controls as a last resort, and try to avoid those regular broad spectrum treatments. I know we all have neighbors that do it, and they every single week there's like a new sign out in front of their house where it says, "Don't touch the lawn because it's been sprayed." Unfortunately, it's just part of our communities, and yeah, we want to try to limit that to just treating problems as they arise instead of just treating things on a regular weekly schedule. Another really a growing problem that I see in our local areas is just excessive lights. So many lights, they use LED lights, solar powered lights. They're so cheap. They're so easy to put all over your landscape. But you really should think about what they're doing to our pollinators at night. There's a lot of plants that only will open their flowers during the nighttime because they've co-evolved with nighttime moths and other pollinators. Artificial lights can really disrupt the navigation of these pollinators. It can disrupt their mating, their feeding. So if you do use lights, try to only use ones that are on motion sensors. Warmer colored bulbs are less attractive to the moths, so using like amber and red colors are less attractive, and also trying to make sure they're not like uplighting things. Use downward directed fixtures. That's going to minimize the unnecessary light pollution that is occurring. So that was my presentation on strategies for pollinator-friendly yards. I do want to remind you that your local extension office is a really great resource to reach out to. We have so many more classes. I teach an hour-long class on butterflies, attracting hummingbirds, just an hour for each one of these different pollinators. So sign up for one of these classes at your local extension office, and just utilize us as a resource. We have so many things to provide. So I want to talk to you about how to participate in the pollinator census, and we'll go over some of the key components of the census so you can either participate in a local group or by yourself. So the biggest reason, why should you take part in this survey, the pollinator census? The biggest reason is it's a citizen science project that we already talked in the other presentation about the importance of citizen science, getting people involved, and just getting a lot of data that the scientific community can utilize. This pollinator census has three major goals beyond just getting people involved with citizen science. It's to create sustainable pollinator habitat. So a lot of these people that are taking part in the census are then going out, they're learning about plants that are really like maybe they sit in front of a tea bush when they're participating in a pollinator census and they see how amazing that bush is at bringing in bees. And then they go home and create some more sustainable pollinator habitat by putting in that native plant that is so great for bees. It's also increasing the entomological literacy of our citizens. So just beyond, oh, that's a bug. We want to educate people about the different types of pollinators. Like a lot of people, before they take part in this census, they're like, flies, pollinators? They have no clue that they are active pollinators until they're out there being mindful and looking at a plant and seeing what's landing on it. And then it is the core part of the census is to generate useful data about pollinator population. So we can spot trends about different types of the different categories of the pollinator population, see if they're declining or if they're affected by weather or how do honeybees influence native bee populations. These are all things they're trying to look at in the data. So the first step to really get involved is to get informed. So you've already made a great big step by signing up for this the speaker series, but there's other ways to get informed. If you like the IFAS Great Florida Pollinator Census, there's going to be regular updates leading up to the census about different places that are holding counts and tips, tricks, and things like that. While I'm talking about tips and tricks, there's also the pre-recorded video for mastering the pollinator census. This is put out by the Great Southeast Pollinator Census. It really goes in depth over the data sheet and how to categorize the different things you'll see. We're going to go over it briefly in this presentation, but watching this YouTube video is a great way to get it cemented into your brain. And then finally, just going through the Great Southeast Pollinator Census website. There's a lot of materials and information on that website to help you fill out the data sheet. So I wanted to highlight two local counts that are being held by 3 of the 5 speakers today. There might be others in our local community, but these are the ones associated with IFAS. So on Friday, August 22nd at 10 a.m., there's going to be one at the Tampa Family Health Center's Community Gardens in Hillsborough County. There'll be a link shared out in the chat to register for that. But I will say I think it might be sold out. I was going to let Tia touch on that at the end of the presentation. Speaking about events that aren't sold out, the Friday, August 22nd event at Shamrock Park in Venice, which is in Sarasota County, we do still have quite a few spots that me and Jackie are hosting that one. But you can also do this pollinator census all by yourself. You can do it in the comfort of your own garden, or you can go to a public garden and just find any flowering plant. And on August 22nd or August 23rd, you can do a local pollinator census at that location. So let's talk about how you do that. So the big components of doing a pollinator census data sheet is you're going to print out the data sheet or you're going to receive it in the mail. You're going to find a flowering plant that you like and you see pollinators going to it. You're going to identify that flowering plant. So try to go to a place that uses signs in the landscape. So like our demonstration gardens at Twin Lakes Park or Shamrock Park, we have signs for almost every plant. And you're gonna write down the name of that plant. You're gonna pull out your phone or a timer and you're gonna set 15 minutes. That's how long each data sheet is gonna be running for. And then you're going to use the printed reference handout to identify pollinators as they land, or I'll talk more about the categories on the next slide, and hopefully you can memorize the categories and what they look like. And yeah, so the data sheet you can see is almost, it's right there in the right. The 8 categories are bumblebees, carpenter bees, honeybees, small bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, and other insects. So I will have to say I did not know the difference between bumblebees and carpenter bees until Jackie taught me, and she used the phrase shiny heinies for carpenter bees and fuzzy fannies for bumblebees. So if you look at a bumblebee, it's going to be a larger bee, larger than a honeybee, and it's going to have a fuzzy abdomen. So that's the rear component of the bee, the fanny. And then the carpenter bee, they're also bigger. In most cases, they're bigger bees than honeybees. Their abdomen is not going to be hairy. Usually you can see it being shiny. So that's the phrase shiny hiney comes into play. Honeybees, they're pretty much the most common bee that you see. The European and African honeybees, they're the ones that we have domesticated. They have large colonies. They're generalist pollinators, so they go to pretty much any flower out there collecting pollen or nectar. Out of our hundreds of native bees, a lot of those are tiny bees that are going to be like leaf cutting bees or minor bees. You don't have to know the many different families and hundreds of different species. If it's a small bee, just mark it as a small bee. Wasps, they are their own category. Then flies, as we've already talked about, they're unknown. They're their own category too. Butterflies, you're gonna run into lots of butterflies. Hopefully, there's some day flying moths, so just put them in the same category, or maybe you do a after hours night census and you can track the moths. We get lots of sphinx moths in our gardens after hours. And then if there's something like a beetle that lands on one of the flowers, you mark it as a other insect, or if you can't identify what it is, just mark it under other insects. Once you have filled out the data sheet, if you're taking part at our census event, we'll handle the data sheets once you've filled it out. Then you will upload it into the University of Georgia website and they tabulate the data. As I said, that data is very important, very useful and important. I will say that this is one of the maps that I pulled up from Tia's presentation on the data, but this is the number of pollinators observed per counter per county, because this census isn't statewide in every county. It isn't at every IFAS office yet, but maybe someday it will be. But yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting to see how some areas of the state had a lot more pollinators per 15-minute interval than others. Sometimes this was based on the species of plant. Sometimes it lined up with like if a county had a lot of agriculture or a lot of wilderness natural areas. So very interesting to look at that data. So to end the presentation, I just wanted to have a open forum. If you've had any questions to any of the presenters, type them into the chat now. If it's a frequently asked question, maybe we can say it out loud. So, and then I was gonna let Tia mention her event in Hillsborough if there was any details about it.
Sure, thanks, Forrest. And there is a question in the chat. So when people are doing the pollinator count, do they need to limit it to a single plant, or can we observe a group of them, such as a black-eyed Susan with a pentas?
It's try to do one plant, but if it's a cluster of plants where you can't tell where one ends and another one begins, like maybe it's a bunch of coreopsis, try to make it a manageable, like 2 feet by 2 feet section. So the official way they do this and the scientific community is they make a quadrat of like sometimes they're pre-made or they make them out of PVC and then they have a set surface area to measure. But just try to think of it that way. You have a little square that you're going to focus on if it's like a grouping of wildflowers and you can't see which stem belongs to which plant.
Great. Yeah, I am looking at the event we're having in Hillsborough County. So we are doing an event at the Tampa Family Health Centers. They have a community garden and doing a little entomology lesson followed up by the pollinator count. And it does say that it's sold out on Eventbrite, so I'll have to check with my partner here and check into that. But I know in Sarasota County, you guys are doing an event at Shamrock Park, correct?
Yes, and that is in South County in southern Venice. But you can also do this in the at your own house. Maybe you have a pollinator garden or a plant that really brings in the pollinators already. You just got to set aside 15 minutes and to complete that data sheet and then upload it when you are done. And we'll send out the websites and the resources we've talked about so you can explore those further and reference them.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have. Thank you, everybody, for attending the webinar. And we'll send up a follow-up email soon. Joanne's asking if there's any events in Osceola County. I believe they are going to do one. So check with your IFAS Extension Center there, or Ava Pavone and the Master Gardeners there.
And just a quick shout out for Lee County. Yes, we're also going to have some. They're just not up on Eventbrite yet.
Great, great. There's
The
going to be
same
in Lee
thing goes
County.
with Manatee County. We are going to do one. It's just not ready yet.
Great. Well, we got a little bit more than a month to plan, and there are going to be events statewide, and they are on the blog that we linked up here. So just check with the county near you and join in, or do it at your own home. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.